I think that most fans can agree that Gojo was set up to fail in his first domain clash with Sukuna because of the fact that Yuji, Choso, and Inumaki didn't tell him that Sukuna doesn't close the barrier of his domain. Gojo had no way of knowing this information on his own, since Sukuna was inside the innate domain of the finger bearer from the detention center the first time that he opened his domain, and Gojo was already sealed inside of the prison realm when Sukuna opened up his domain in Shibuya for the second time. Thus, the only way he could have known beforehand was if he was told about it. I'm not sure why this crucial bit of information wasn't shared with everyone in the group in the time skip leading up to the Shinjuku showdown. But regardless, it meant that as soon as Gojo tried to clash domain expansions with Sukuna the regular way, Sukuna was able to have his sure hit effect bypass the exterior of Gojo's domain. Since domain expansions usually have a self-imposed binding vow to trap your opponents inside, it means that they have to give up strength on the outside in order to gain more strength on the inside of the barrier. Thus, Sukuna's slashes were easily able to break Gojo's domain expansion from the outside, which left Gojo in a vulnerable position without his curse technique due to curse technique burnout. Luckily though, through the use of the 6 eyes, Gojo is so efficient with his cursed energy consumption that he had enough energy left to still smartly make use of a mix of simple domain, falling blossom emotion, and reverse curse technique to ensure that Sukuna still couldn't get rid of him, even while standing in the midst of an active malevolent shrine. Now, when it comes to Yuki Tsukumo, Yuki, together with Choso, was one of the people tasked with protecting Master Tengen's body from Kenjaku. See, in the year 2006, when Toji Fushiguro killed Riko Amanai, who was considered as a star plasma vessel, someone with the right genetic compatibility for being able to assimilate or fuse with Tengen and reset their aging, Tengen was left without anyone compatible enough to fuse with, and aged so much so that their human body ascended into becoming a cursed spirit. Later on in 2018, through the conversations Yuki has with Tengen, we find out that there were indeed more star plasma vessels, but that none of them were as compatible as Riko. And because of this, combined with the fact that Tengen figured that eventually evolving was inevitable, Tengen decided to just let the evolution process happen. This all then set the stage for Kenjaku to use the body of the now deceased Suguru Geto and make use of his cursed spirit manipulation technique to enact his plan of trying to fuse Tengen with all of humanity. And after rather easily defeating Choso, the only one who stood in his way now was Yuki. Similar to Gojo when fighting Sukuna, Yuki was also going to most likely lose the clash of domains with Kenjaku, who also possesses an open domain just like Sukuna. With it, Kenjaku's sure hit would also most likely extend past the range of Yuki's barrier and break it from the outside. I remember that when the Star and Oil chapters were first coming out, that we as fans of the series thought that Tengen was the one who set Yuki up to fail, because it was Tengen's fault that Yuki opted for a simple domain instead of trying to domain clash with Kenjaku. However, hindsight is indeed 2020, and we now know that had she not done so, her sure hit would have cancelled out with Kenjaku's sure hit within the domain, while Kenjaku would still be free to break the barrier from the outside, meaning that once Yuki's domain would have broken, she would be left with curse technique burnout, and would have been in an even worse position than that she actually was in the manga. Unlike Gojo, Yuki doesn't have the 6 eyes to boost her cursed energy proficiency, meaning that had she indeed expanded her domain, it's unlikely that she would have been able to do so for a second time within that same fight. Not to mention that she isn't able to spam simple domain like Gojo can to protect herself from the sure hit after losing the domain clash to give herself time to heal. If she was able to do so, she would have most likely done so in the actual manga too, seeing as that her whole plan was to use simple domain to buy time for Tengen to dismantle Kenjaku's domain. The main reason why Tengen opted to go with the plan of Yuki using simple domain was because if Yuki initiated the domain clash and Kenjaku opened his domain afterwards as a counter, Yuki's domain would have been the one with its shell being the exterior one, and thus if Tengen tried to dismantle the domain expansions, Yuki's domain would be the first to fall, since her barrier shell, being the outside one, means that it was more in contact with Tengen's Sunyata barrier. This is also shown in the Gojo vs Jogo fight in episode 7, where Jogo already had his domain expanded, and because Gojo did his afterwards and won, it meant that his shell was technically inside of Jogo's shell. Obviously, this was all under the assumption that Kenjaku had a closed domain, like most characters in the series do. The reality, however, is that Kenjaku had an open domain, and with binding vows, could probably adjust the range of his sure hit too, meaning that even if Tengen was ready to dismantle his domain with a range that extended past Yuki's, if he shrunk his range even slightly so that it just barely went past Yuki's barrier, the sure hit would become more effective and break her barrier even faster. We know this is possible too because 1. Sukuna does this as well so that Megami doesn't get caught up in the range of Malevolent Shrine in Shibuya, and 2. Because Kenjaku was able to use his body as a domain to raise the limits of his lapse technique's activation time and unsteady output, meaning that he is so proficient with barrier techniques that he knows how to keep the range of his domain expansions to just his own body. A very impressive feat. The reality of the situation is that Yuki not fully knowing what Kenjaku was capable of means that her fate was essentially sealed the moment she chose to try and protect Tengen. Whether she went with Tengen's plan or not, she would have lost to Kenjaku either way. Now, I will say that there might also appear to be some level of plot armor taking place. On Twitter, Kaio Breeze explains that in their opinion, it's weird how this one particular punch from Yuki at the start of the fight has enough force to completely blow off both of Kenjaku's arms and push him with so much force that he breaks out of Tengen's Sunyata barrier. Yet, the punch wasn't able to take off Kenjaku's head cleanly. There isn't a clear explanation given, but in my personal opinion, I think it's because Kenjaku used a combination of spinning to minimize contact and simultaneously trying to dodge it. After all, we don't get to see the other side of Kenjaku's face that was actually hit. Instead, it's just kind of shaded out in black. If he was indeed able to do that successfully, then it would be that even just slightly grazing his face was enough to send him that far. Which would sort of make sense, considering that both of his arms that he used to block his face had different degrees of damage, indicating that how easily Yuki is able to break stuff depends on how clean the attack landed. Kind of like how when we catch a ball, we instinctively lower our hands during the catching motion to spread the amount of force out and lessen the impact. Even though I said that Yuki was doomed from the moment that she decided to protect Tengen, you might remember how Yuki, Yuta, and Choso had to choose between which of them stayed behind and which one headed into the colonies. Perhaps if Choso was swapped out with Yuta, it might have gone differently, seeing as that Yuta also has a domain of his own, meaning that they'd have 2 opportunities to try and analyze and beat Kenjaku's domain strategy. However, I think that in this scenario, chances are that they'd fail too. The thing is that it's narratively required for Kenjaku to gain possession of Tengen for the plot to move forward. So chances are that Gege would have just given Kenjaku the ability to open his domain fully multiple times a day like Sukuna can. In fact, Kenjaku does open his domain twice, once in the initial clash against Yuki using gravity, and secondly versus Yuki's black hole using anti-gravity. And again, this stays in line with the already established story, as Kenjaku was deemed as the first or second best barrier technique user, depending on how you look at it. Maybe a 3v1 of Yuki, Yuta, and Choso could have worked, but then the team wouldn't have anyone powerful enough to invade the Sendai colony and gain points there, meaning that it would have most likely taken even longer to try and enact Megami's plan of both saving his sister and unsealing Satoru Gojo. Throughout the series, we've seen that Jujutsu sorcerers almost never actually achieve their personal goals and dreams. Everything always comes at a price of something else, an endless cycle of gain and loss. Though Yuki wasn't able to achieve her goals on her own, I do think that our protagonist, Yuji Itadori, will see them through for her. With the book of her life's work and research left behind, Yuji will use that to further himself as a sorcerer, and along with it, help achieve the goal that Yuki left behind. But what do you guys think? Do you think that there was a possibility that Yuki could have won against Kenjaku somehow? And if not, do you think that Yuji will help realize her dreams, or at the very least, help further her research on the soul? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks for watching this video to the end. I was honestly blown away by the reception to my last video, and didn't really know how I could even follow it up. Anyways, more content is on the way, so make sure to comment, like, subscribe if you like this type of content. See ya!